This is 1A. I'm Jenn White here in Wichita, Kansas, hosting a special edition of KMUW's Engage ICT. And today we're talking about a growing problem, from false claims about a stolen presidential election to skepticism about the COVID-19 vaccine. We've seen a sharp rise in people sharing misinformation in recent years. Quickly, by a show of hands, how many of you have seen misinformation online that was shared by a friend or a family member, or maybe you accidentally shared it yourself? I think almost every hand here is raised. And the numbers, the data, reflects your experience. On Twitter, people are 70% more likely to share something that is false instead of true. That's according to a 2018 study from MIT. So how can we sort truth and facts from falsehoods and opinions? We've teamed up with 6 stations, including KMUW, to stay in tune with what you're thinking about when it comes to issues related to bolstering our democracy. And tonight we want to hear from you about how misinformation spreads in your communities, how to identify it, and how to stop it. So joining us on stage is Professor Mythili Menon. She's director of the Linguistics program at Wichita State University. Her most recent research project is a study of the online spread of misinformation and how false news articles get shared on social media. Mythili, thanks for being here.
Welcome. I'm happy to be here.
Next to her is Tom Shine. He's the Director of News and Public Affairs at KMUW. Prior to that, he spent 37 years as a reporter and editor at the Wichita Eagle newspaper. Tom, thanks for having us.
Thanks, Jen.
And Sarah Kittrell is a librarian and collection development division manager at the Wichita Public Library. Sarah, it's great to have you.
Thank you so much.
And we want to hear from you. How have you seen misinformation spread in Wichita? Has it affected your relationships with friends, family, or coworkers? What questions do you have for our panelists about misinformation, and what do you think can be done to help stop the spread? Text us your questions and comments, and to get started, text 1A to 1-844-777-7050. That number's also on your program. Mythili, let's just start with definitions. How do you define misinformation?
So misinformation is false information that is spread on the web, and it doesn't necessarily have an intent to mislead the reader. As opposed to, say, disinformation, which is purposefully crafted. It's often fabricated information, fabricated narrative, very often in the umbrella term of propaganda, that has this malicious content and intention to malign a particular group or community or a particular cause.
How big of a problem is misinformation at this moment in our democracy?
Well, misinformation has been around for many, many years. It's become a global phenomenon because of the access to information, especially because of technology use. And we live in the digital era, we live in the digital media. So it's a problem that has become a global level, and the scale of the issue has become rather big. We talked about misinformation and disinformation, but 2 other kind of issues that is related to this umbrella term of misinformation is fake news. That's been around, I want to say, since 2016. We keep hearing this term, and also a particularly new and challenging concept called deep fake. That's something that's, very often we talk about. It's basically a distorted audio or image or a video which is made to look authentic. So it is a pre-existing video, and you malign a person in that particular video, and you insert, say, a celebrity or a public figure. And the reach of these deep fake videos is so viral because of social media and the way that it is spread in social media platforms, as well as YouTube and other TikTok and other video platforms.
So with that context, how much more difficult has it gotten for media consumers to discern fact from misinformation or fake news or a deep fake? How hard has that gotten?
It's gotten very hard, especially within, the last 5 years or so, because deepfake is created by algorithms. And these are the same kind of algorithms that social media platforms are using. So when we talk about advertisements that we are engaging with in social media platforms, what sort of advertisements are we engaging with? Who's paying for these advertisements? And many often we hear the term clickbaits. So these are news articles or videos that are created to entice the reader into clicking them because the social media company is making profit. And so we are being shown what somebody else is paying for, and very often that might not be a fact, or that might not be the truth. It might be something that has a political agenda or a religious agenda behind it. So the problem, I think, has become really aggravated because of various advanced machine learning techniques that we have currently and sophisticated algorithms that we have within these kind of social media platforms.
By show of hand, how many people are on some form of social media at this point? Pretty much everybody? Okay. I want you to think back to long ago when you first joined your first social media platform, be it Facebook or Twitter or Instagram. By show of hands, would you say your experience today is dramatically different than it was when you first joined? Yeah. Okay, good number of people there. So Tom, you're a journalist, of course, at KMUW, and I'm curious what new challenges you find yourself facing in combating and countering misinformation, specifically in Wichita.
Yeah, I don't know that the challenges are new necessarily. As Mythili said, 2016 is when it really started to get really kind of overheated a little bit. Traditional media, which is considered very untrustworthy already, really took a beating from the Trump administration and in that time period, sometimes deservedly so. But it really hurt us in terms of our credibility. We weren't very good with transparency in many cases. But it became easy to dismiss traditional media by simply saying, well, it's fake news, which didn't mean that the story was wrong or inaccurate, just that it didn't care for it, didn't care for the tone of it, didn't care that it pushed back against perhaps a narrative that they preferred. And in the age of social media, it is really easy to attack the messenger, both as an institution but also personally, and sometimes very, very, very viciously. So it made it a lot harder to say, well, do I want to step out and call somebody out on this story, knowing that I'm going to get a lot of pushback on it, and so that can be very difficult. I think the Wichita media does a good job pushing back against statements or false information, but there's fewer of us. Like in many cities, there's a reduction of journalists, so it's an uphill battle.
Yeah, yeah. Now, Sarah, librarians have traditionally helped the public access information. So in a lot of ways, you're on the front lines of the misinformation battle, and I'm curious how librarians specifically are facing this challenge.
We actually have not necessarily faced questions that we would consider based on misinformation, because people don't necessarily come to us with that information. Sometimes they perceive that we have a bias, which we as librarians have zero opinions when we are at work. And so it is our job, when we are confronted with what we do term to be misinformation, not to change someone's mind, but to show them reliable resources that they can use to educate themselves. This was particularly in evidence at the beginning of the pandemic, when people were learning about COVID-19 on Facebook and all the cures that were miracle cures, and someone's cousin's uncle's father took something and it was a miracle. So it was our job to help them find research studies, perhaps, or credible resources that they could use to learn about whatever questions they have, and make sure that those resources are verifiable in other resources. So not just one Google search. It is also in this peer-reviewed journal. It is in a book that was published by a reputable publisher. And making sure they know what sources we used to find that information.
In your efforts to point people to that information, did you bump up against the issue of confirmation bias, basically our tendency to seek out information that supports what we already believe?
I think likely that is true. But as I said, it's not our job to change people's minds. It's not our job to share our opinions at work and our own confirmation biases. It is our job to find the most accurate information we can to answer whatever questions we receive.
Mythili, what factors make someone more likely to share misinformation?
So I want to piggyback on what Sarah just said about the confirmation bias. I am a linguist, but I work at the intersection of linguistics and psychology, and there's been a lot of information and a lot of research that looks at the psychology behind misinformation. And one of the things that keeps coming up is that there are social, cognitive, and affective factors that influence your decision making process, especially in discerning whether a piece of news article is true or false. I mean, going back to the confirmation bias that we just heard about, we really want to believe that what we believe is true. And so we seek out that information. Our brain, our cognition is wired in such a way that we want acceptance. So we are going to share something on social media because our friends and family shared it. Or there's that social endorsement kind of cognitive bias that we talk about, that if we see somebody that we really care about share something on Twitter, we are more than likely to believe that that information is true, even though that person might not be a reporter or somebody who is a credible source of information. So we really have to be cognizant of the fact that we have these cognitive biases like confirmation bias and social endorsement bias, and just be aware of the fact that when we read a news article, just ask yourself, is this true? Is this something that I truly believe in? And then kind of deliberate a little bit without just going in with your intuition and your gut, because we are emotional. And we think with our emotion, and sometimes we believe things because of our emotion. And so if there's a news article that is a sensational piece of news article, we might be more likely to believe that because our emotions are predisposed in believing that.
Are there certain communities where people are more likely to be exposed to misinformation?
Are you talking about communities within Wichita or just in general?
I would love to hear both, generally speaking, and
Sure.
specifically in Wichita as well.
Yeah. So, when we talk about misinformation, we often talk about misinformation in English because the language of the internet is English and it's easily accessible, easily available. But there are lesser studies that have been done on misinformation in other languages, Spanish being one of the largest spoken languages in Wichita, but also other languages across the world. And so one of the things that we have encountered in my research lab is that, Spanish-speaking populations are more likely to be exposed to misinformation at faster rates than English-speaking population, because those kind of news articles don't get taken down as much as English misinformation, just because there's a lot of people policing and monitoring and fact-checking English sources, and not as much with the Hispanic population, the Spanish-speaking population. One of the things that we've been finding is that social messaging platforms such as WhatsApp and Telegram create these kind of social echo chambers, especially for non-English speaking population. They get drawn into these social echo chambers. It has a malicious content and a maligning content aspect to it. And these people have absolutely no way of verifying information. They are in that social echo chamber. That's what they believe. And this happened with the COVID vaccine hesitation that we saw with respect to the Hispanic population, especially, where they were less likely to believe that the COVID vaccination would be a good thing versus something that is a bad thing that the government was creating. So we see that social echo chambers very often in non-English speaking populations.
Yeah. Sarah, I'm curious in the library setting whether or not that becomes a challenge, being able to, when people come into the library and perhaps Spanish is their first language, being able to connect them to resources that they can help them do the kind of research you were talking about earlier.
That is very true. We are constantly working to upgrade our resources for our Spanish-speaking population. We do have a branch location that is in a primarily Spanish-speaking neighborhood with a vast majority of Spanish-speaking staff. So we are able to work with them to find trustworthy information, but we definitely need to continue to work to build our resources that are current and accurate, and everything we try to be for that population.
Just a reminder, if you want to ask a question or share your thoughts, text the number 1 and the letter A to 1-844-777-7050. That's 844-777-7050. And make sure to include your first name, your question, and whether or not you want us to read it as a text or you want to share it on the microphone. We got this question from someone in the audience who says, how do you explain to someone what a reliable source is? And I'd love to hear from each of you because you might have slightly different takes on this, but Sarah, I'll come to you first.
For me, when we are looking for reliable sources, we have multiple databases that have peer-reviewed articles, which means that someone else in the field has read through it and agrees that this is what is true, or it was a replicated experiment, that sorts of thing. So that is, we definitely use our databases quite frequently. Same for reference books, but we also have trusted media that we will use to confirm something, maybe not as a first source, but if we find it one place. In library school, they taught us to confirm with 3 different sources. So we certainly try to meet that and not just go to Wikipedia. So Wikipedia,
Tom,
not
I saw
reliable.
Tom nod when you say confirm with 3 different
that's
sources.
Great. That's man. You guys are tough.
Tom, when you're explaining what a reliable source is to someone, especially through that journalistic lens, how do you describe it?
Well, first of all, it needs to be someone who's on the record, and you can use their name and their title. I think the media has hurt itself over the years by using unnamed sources, which we know from research people don't believe, and sometimes rightfully so. So it's a named source. It's someone who has firsthand knowledge of what you're writing about, either being a part of a meeting, being the author of a survey or a document, somebody who has not heard it from somebody else or has some secondhand notion. It's firsthand, original sourcing, and then even with that, we would try to find another source, maybe not 3 like the librarians, but at least try to find one other source that can confirm that as well, who also will go on the record.
Mythili, in your research, how are you defining reliable source?
So I agree with everything that Tom and Sarah said. And, sometimes we're just very busy people. It's not easy for us to do our own research. So there are 3 websites that, I tell my students to kind of go back to. Factcheck.org is University of Pennsylvania, Annenberg School of Journalism's fact-checking website. So they will do the work for you if you don't have the time. Politico Fact, which is Tampa-based nonpartisan website, again, to check political accuracy, political speech accuracy, etc. That's a great website as well. And Snopes.com is another great resource. If you are unsure of whether the news article that you're reading is true or false, just go to Snopes.com. Somebody else has done that research, and it will tell you this is true or this is false. So these are the 3 websites that I would recommend.
Well, someone in the audience was already ahead of you on that. They wanted to know if Snopes was a good way to research information. Tom, we have to acknowledge the fact that misinformation shared online is also finding its way into state legislatures. Here in Kansas, a Republican state senator, Mark Steffen, recently called on health officials in Reno County to be fired for offering the FDA-approved COVID vaccines to young children. And in a Facebook post, Steffen called the vaccine dangerous, though that's been proven false. They've proven to be safe and are FDA approved for emergency authorization. But how are you seeing misinformation shared among and by elected officials in Kansas?
It happens quite frequently, and because they're politicians, so they understand what they need to do to get reelected. One thing that was different this year was, in the state legislature anyway, I thought it was different, was they had a lot of speakers and panels where they let people come in and kind of carry the water on some of this, what we would consider conspiracy theory stuff or stuff that's not vetted in truth. So rather than a legislator saying it, they provided a forum for people to come. There was a committee, the Special Committee on Government Overreach and the Impact of COVID-19 Mandates, had a hearing, allowed people to come in, share what most federal health officials would consider false vaccine information and also false COVID-19 cure information, but gave them a forum to do that. Didn't question them, didn't push back on any of that, and then let them do that. Did the same thing with a guy named who was part of the Douglas Frank, who's a big 2020 election fraud guy. He's been touring the country, spoke to the House Elections Committee, pushed theories that have been proven false by other mathematicians and political experts, but allowed him a forum to spread that theory. So they've done that a little bit, and that way take some of the onus off them directly, but they've given forum to people to kind of share their beliefs and thoughts without it coming directly back on them.
How does that complicate your work as a journalist? There's some really interesting research out of the Poynter Institute about how misinformation is spread and how even when you, for instance, do a story on misinformation and rebut or push back on that misinformation, the fact that you've platformed it also allows it to spread. So how does that complicate your job?
That's a good question, because do you cover the event when you know that the person speaking is not going to be, what he's saying is not provable, and it's actually been proven false in many cases. We had the same problem many years ago. People here will remember, we had a group out of Topeka, the Phelps family, who were strongly anti-gay and protested at funerals of people who died of AIDS. Then they started protesting in military funerals. And their intent was, we were going down the drain because we were coddling the homosexual culture and things like that. Very in your face, very upfront. And we finally made a decision, look, we need to stop covering them. They're not making news. They're trying to create news, but that the fact that they're protesting is not news. And we stopped covering at the paper fairly early on. And I think you have to make those decisions as well in some of these cases. But when a person is speaking to a legislative body, to me that raises the ante a little bit. Well, they're speaking in Topeka. Do we need to cover that?
Now, Facebook is also at the center of the Secretary of State race here in Kansas. Tell us about what's happening there.
There's a Republican primary for the Secretary of State. The current Secretary of State is a Republican. One of the candidates accused the current Secretary of State, Scott Schwab, of taking money from Mark Zuckerberg's civic group to help elections in the 2020 election. Many Republicans find that offensive. Accused him of taking money, which is not true. Mike Brown is the candidate. Mike Brown, when he was a Johnson County commissioner, actually voted to take money for Johnson County from the same group. But now he's trying to turn it around and lay the blame on Scott Schwab, which isn't true. The Kansas Reflector, which is one of those nonprofit media groups that sprung up in the last 5 years, did some very good reporting on that if you want to go to their website and read it. But it's just not true. I mean, it's just not true. But yet he puts it out because he doesn't worry about pushback, or if he does, he doesn't care about pushback because he's going to say what he wants to say and whatever.
We got another question from the audience. Is there a study that reflects how people who receive information from social media compared to those who don't are more likely to be misinformed? I do not belong to social media platforms. Congratulations. And notice people on social media seem to be quite convinced by the content they receive. Mythili, is this part of your research at all?
Yeah, I haven't seen a study that actually looks at people who are not on social media. Predominantly because I belong to a university, it's really easy to find, young people who are always on social media. So they become, my guinea pigs for experiments. But this would actually make a really good research study if we are able to find, people who are not on social media. I will say this, though, that, in the research studies that I've conducted, we do find effects of age. So we do find that misinformation spread is more among younger generation, say 25 to 35 within that age group. And there's also, gender also does play a role in that kind of misinformation spread, as opposed to older people who actually have different sources of where they get their news from. So if you ask, very often if you ask a student of mine, they will say, oh, I get my news source is Facebook, right, or Twitter. But when you ask an older person, that news source is going to change, and then you see that there's less of that misinformation, clickbait, satire kind of articles that are shared or believed in.
If whoever shared that comment would be willing to text us again, I would love to know where you get your news from. I'd love to know what sources you go to. So send us another text if you don't mind. Sarah, in a lot of communities across the country, we're seeing increased pressure on school librarians, community librarians to limit information by removing certain books, usually books dealing with race or the experiences of LGBTQ people. How has that pressure played out here in this library system?
I believe that Wichita Public Library, in terms of print materials, has been relatively lucky in that we have not had significant challenges to the content of our collections. We have had, in the last year, 3 challenges to picture books that had LGBTQ themes to them. 2 challenges on one on another. So I guess the one sparked conversation. I actually welcome challenges, though, because we put a lot of work into our selection policy for our materials, and we want a collection that is broad and diverse and reflects our community in all of its shades of every color, all of the views that Wichitans hold. And I think it shows we're doing our job when there is controversial material in there, or material that people do find controversial. It means people are finding material that expands or could potentially expand their horizon, could plant a seed to think about, learn about. We have had other issues. We did have a story hour with drag queens, which ended up with a year's worth of board meetings discussing it. But books, we've been relatively lucky, I think, so far, knock on wood. People will listen to this and then come challenge all of the materials.
So but I want to ask you a follow-up to that, but Martin has a question. And Martin, if you could come to the mic and we'll get your question in just a second. What is the process for book selection, or if a book is challenged, what does that process look like?
So book selection, we have a team of people who select materials. I oversee that team. We look at reviews for materials. We look at bestseller lists. We look at the authority of the author. Are they a university professor? Are they an expert in their field? We look at the local connection. So we do want to feature all of our local authors and welcome donations from them. And then we look at community interest. So for reconsideration, what we do is a person will come to one of our service points and mention that they have an issue.
Let's just hold. We're going to wait for the train to pass. Hopefully it's a short train. And hopefully you can hold your thoughts, Sarah. Okay, I think we're safe.
Okay. People will come to us and mention that they have an issue with a book. We have been doing a significant amount of training with staff to identify what exactly the issue is. It could be they just want to tell someone they have an issue with the book and they don't need it to go any further. We then have them fill out a form explaining what issue they have with the material. Our library director will assign a committee of 3 people to read or view the material in question, and then they will have a discussion and decide whether or not it stays in the collection. There have been instances where we have pulled items from the collection, but they are very rare, and they result in errors in selection. We did let a revisionist history get in once, and that was definitely a mistake on our part. I'm glad that someone challenged it so we could make sure that it did not revise anyone else's opinions.
So just a quick reminder, if you have questions or comments you want to share, you can text 1A to 1-844-777-7050. That's 1-844-777-7050. Martin is with us. Martin, what's your question?
I'm going to step away from the question I actually typed earlier and ask something else. Well, as a librarian, as a Kansan, I had a third grade teacher who was also a librarian, and she taught me about free Kansas. You know, taught me about John Brown. She taught me about what a great state that we live in and the rich history that we have. But I found the majority of kids and even adults do not know that the history of Kansas, bloody Kansas, and the trials and tribulations that our state had to go through in order to be, to become what it is now. But how do we pull folks out of this echo chamber? Like, we have a lot of people that are around us that maybe, let's call them GOP conservatives, or people that aren't necessarily Trumpites. Like, how do we pull them out of that echo chamber and get them to think and to reason and to think critically?
We have a program that we have been doing, and of course, I'm blanking on the name of it, but it involves bringing people from different sides together to discuss issues in our community, to make sure that all sides are represented. I think that these community conversations are an area that we're really trying to push forward, to have those difficult discussions, because the library at its root is a neutral territory. As I said earlier, we have no opinions while we are at work. And we want it to be a safe space for people to explore and learn. I think library programming does an excellent job of bringing up these difficult conversations. And we hope to do a lot more in the future to help bring people into conversations, and then maybe they will hear something that sparks an idea that they had not considered or challenges their bias that they have, to dive deeper and learn more.
I was talking to Sarah before we started, and I said libraries really are today's public square. But I'm curious to hear from you as a Kansan whether you think there are other spaces other than the library where people gather in that way anymore.
Well, what I attempted to do here, I was the former commander of the oldest VFW here in Kansas, Post 112. It actually turned 100 years old a couple years ago, and I tried to make it a space for the community as a whole, especially on the south side of Wichita, which is predominantly poor folks, on the lower echelons of the economic scale, predominantly Latino, African American. Even just having the county come in, Central County, and open a COVID clinic there became a point of contention. We essentially almost had a fight within the VFW post in order to just have a COVID clinic held there at the post. And I told them, what is the purpose of our post if we're not helping the community, if we're not out here using our veteran status to help improve the neighborhoods and the world in which we reside in? So I attempted to create that space, but unfortunately I was called a communist. I was called a lot of vitriolic and hateful things. I even got text messages on my phone telling me that nobody wanted me back. And I understand this is just a handful of them, because some of the men in there, which a lot of them are Vietnam veterans, they may have archaic or antiquated ways of thinking, but I know they accepted me as an individual, but a part of me also feels that they only accepted me simply because I fought for this country, and simply that is all. That no other reason but that, instead of just accepting me as a human being, But so,
Martin, thank you for sharing that. We appreciate it. We heard from Sarah about how the library is working to create a space where people can come together to engage in these sometimes very difficult conversations. Tom, do you think media has a role to play in popping some of these bubbles, these echo chambers we exist in? Can we do it, considering media is so splintered these days?
I think we do have a role, and I think we can do it. I think the best thing we can do is continue to report and do our jobs to the best of our ability, and get the information out there. Will it get read by the people in their bubble? Maybe, maybe not. but if you don't put the information out there, it'll never get read by anybody. One thing that we as a radio station is doing, we're talking about difficult conversations, is one small step. Shout out to Sarah Jane there, which is we're doing it with NPR and bringing people from different sides of the political divide just to have conversations, not about politics, but about themselves, about their backgrounds, about their lives, and try to get an understanding of each other on a personal level and not on a political level. And it's not easy, as Sarah Jane can tell you that. It's a lot of work, but and it's one conversation at a time. But I think it's and we do it with the StoryCorps people. But that's how you got to start. You got to start somewhere.
Yeah, and I'll say Remaking America, the project we're engaged in for the next 2 years, is how we're trying to do that. We deliberately, when we chose the 6 partner stations, we deliberately chose stations that were not, part of the normal East Coast, West Coast media landscape that people hear. So we're here in Wichita. We're going to be at KUNC in Colorado. We're in Louisville. We are in California, but we're in Fresno, and we're in Birmingham and Austin. So we chose places that were sort of outside of where people think the news comes from, because the news comes from all over. Mythili, I want to come back to this question of the public square and where people are finding the space to have these conversations or not, because I think the new default is social media, which is not productive, I think, for a number of reasons. But are there other places people are finding these kinds of connections and the ability to talk through some of the issues they may be conflicted about?
University classroom. A university is so diverse. We see people from all walks of life. We see people from different age groups, gender orientation. And a classroom is really a space, I think, where we really encourage that kind of critical thinking. So, the same kind of ground rules that you laid out for this event is kind of how many of us, professors, we kind of say, that we're going to be talking about things that might make you uncomfortable, but we really want to know what you think and what your opinion is and what your worldview is and what you believe in, because your worldview and what you believe is really going to make a difference in whether you're actually going to believe misinformation or whether you're actually going to seek out that kind of truth. So, at the university, we have events that are open to the public, and so that would be a space for people to come together to have those kind of difficult conversations. And we also, we have courses that are also open to the public, and so that's something that if people are interested in would be a great occasion to meet somebody who they might not have met otherwise in Wichita. So.
Just by show of hands again, can you call to mind a place, so not social media, but a physical place you can go to engage in difficult conversations in a way that feels fruitful or beneficial? Just raise your hand if you can think of a space. So maybe 5 people. Wow, okay, 6. Huh. All right, we're gonna do a little bit of an exercise now. Mythili, you created a news database to aid in your research. First, explain what it is and how it works.
So my colleagues at University of San Antonio, Texas, and we have been conducting an online news sharing game experiment where we test participants across the globe, and we ask them, whether certain pieces of news that we take from the internet are true or false, and then we ask them if they would share this on social media. And what social media platform would they share this at? So in order to do this, we had a couple of great research assistants who created these kind of news databases for us. So we have, thousands of news articles that we have taken from the internet. They are both true and false news articles. So, Snopes.com and other places where we have scraped this data from. And so we show this, it's a news sharing game, so we show the headline as well as 250 words of this news article, and then we give them 2 minutes to read it, and we ask them, in a baseline condition, we ask them, is this true or is this false? But we also, we are experimenters, so we love experimenting and manipulating conditions. So we had different conditions, such as peer share condition, where we will tell them, oh, your loved one shared this on Facebook. Will you share this on social media? Or we told them, this article did not trend on Twitter. Will you share this news article now? And so what we found was that overall, people are really conservative at sharing false articles. But when they are told that their peers, their loved ones did not share this news article on internet, or we told them that this article did not trend on the internet, or we told them we're going to give you like $1 for sharing this article versus like $1,000, people shared false articles less than when they would if they did not have these extra pieces of information. So this is the news database that Jenn is talking about that we created for the study.
Okay, so we're gonna have a little fun now. So for the purposes of this experiment, I'm gonna read you two of it's either a headline or a social media post. These are real, and for the sake of argument, we're gonna say that both of these went viral. So this is your baseline. I'm gonna read the first one, and then by show of hands, I just wanna know if you think the headline is true or not, okay? The 1918 flu did not kill 50,000 people. Vaccines that the government forced them to take did, and they are repeating the same pattern now. So by show of hands, how many of you think that headline is true? And just, from your gut. And I can read it again. Want me to read it one more time for you? Okay. The 1918 flu did not kill 50 million people. Vaccines that the government forced them to take did, and they are repeating the same pattern now. So by show of hands, how many people think this headline is true? How many people think it's false? Mythili, true or false?
False. Okay,
so in that post, is there anything from your perspective that would automatically say, that's something I need to look at more critically?
So linguistically, when you look at this headline, you can see that this is a sensational piece of headline. It is emotionally charged. It is meant to arouse those emotions in you and be like, oh yeah, I never trusted vaccinations, and look at that. Like, this confirms my bias against that, vaccination hesitancy or something like that. So very often, you look for these kind of linguistic cues when you read headlines: sensationalism, emotionally charged, fabricated, misleading, or biased. So that's really, I think, what everybody caught on. Good job.
Mm-hmm. And in the spirit of just keeping things fact-based, a vaccine did not exist in 1918 for that flu pandemic, according to the CDC, which is why it was so deadly. So let's go to another headline. Black and Asian individuals are up to 2 times more likely to contract COVID-19 than white people, comprehensive new research has warned. I'll read it one more time. Black and Asian individuals are up to 2 times more likely to contract COVID-19 than white people, comprehensive new research has warned. Okay. If you think it's true, raise your hand. And if you think it's false, raise your hand. Okay, maybe 2/3 to a third. Mythili?
This is true.
Okay, so coming across that headline, what stands out for you?
So linguistically, again, just comparing this with the 1918 Spanish flu headline, this is stated as an objective fact, right? So there's really no sensationalism, no emotional charging. You probably can trace this back to the original research article, which is probably peer-reviewed, appeared in a journal. You can probably also verify the sources, like, maybe a couple of different sources, like how Sarah said, 3, right? So you can verify this piece of information, but you can also check the credibility of the author. So most likely, somebody like Tom, right, a reporter. So you can check the credibility of the author. So really that objective, the way that it's stated as a fact is something that I think is why many people said that was true.
So while we're online and we're looking at information, watch for posts that are emotionally charged. There were lots of exclamation points in that first post that I couldn't share with you because it's in print. You say make sure it's verifiable information. Any other things we should watch for?
Yeah, there's a person called Mike Caulfield who's a researcher in University of Washington, and he has something called a SIFT method, SIFT. So when you're sifting through news and social media, stop, so that's S, stop. I is investigate the source, so verify that this is actually a credible piece of information. F is find the claims and trace it back to a verifiable context. And T is actually trace individual quotations or claims that this person has made, again, to that kind of verifiable sources and credibility and transparency. So we often talk about, evidence-based research, right? So going back to that scientific evidence-based research, that's why the true article, many people thought that that was true because it goes back to that science and that evidence-based kind of research methodology that we talk about.
I would add another S, slow down. I think that in social media, things move so quickly. You'll click a like or a retweet or what have you without really taking the time to read the article that's attached to the headline. So maybe sift instead of just sift, an extra S in there. We got this question from Neil who says, what role can student journalists play in combating misinformation, especially if they are fluent in social media dialect that befuddle many of us? Tom, I want to hear from you first, but I would love to hear from Mythili and Sarah on this as well, because I'm sure you have librarians coming in who maybe are a little more versed in social media and can help run interference a bit. Go ahead, Tom.
Well, I think student journalists are probably on social media more than many journalists are. So their ability to, the biggest issue for me is people sharing or retweeting or reposting information that may or may not be true, and they've made no effort to find out whether or not it's true. And I'm on social media maybe an hour and a half a day, maybe 2 hours tops. Students, it's probably 8 to 10 hours, I would guess, or certainly 8. So their ability to have an impact on that is huge. And I would like to think student journalists would sift a little bit, or at least stop and think, now, really, that's true? Before they're retweeted, but so many people don't do that.
Mm-hmm. Sarah, what about in the library space? Not so much around the student journalist question, but how the digital space is evolving and how you're having to adjust the way you approach your work to accommodate this new flow of information.
Yeah, we have definitely made strides in the online world since the pandemic started, as we had to move a lot of programming online. It opened up a lot of different avenues we had not explored yet. But for student journalists or anyone, I think the key is not to share until you know it is true. We have resources to help research that and staff at the phones who are happy to help do some research. And just make sure, and if you find the facts and you feel comfortable, you can try to stop that sharing, tell someone that's, in a non-confrontational way, perhaps share the resources you have found that might make them think in the future as well.
Siobhan has a question in the audience, and Siobhan, if you want to come to the mic to ask your question, please head this way. If not, just text us and let us know you want us to read the text. Mythili, I wanted to hear from you as well as Siobhan's getting to the mic.
So one thing, an undergraduate student of mine who is not in journalism, what we've been doing is to create these kind of infographics. So, very simple visual infographics on what to do. Like, the first step may be to stop and actually ask yourself, is this true? And then kind of proceed to check the source and verify whether it's a credible author, check whether this is clickbait or satire or humor, and then maybe even, go to one of those kind of fact-checking websites that I mentioned and kind of check if somebody else has done the research to say that this is maybe a true article or a false article. But we are highly visual learners, and creating those kind of infographics is a really great way, to kind of get the message across that we need to be a little bit more careful in what we are sharing online.
Siobhan, go ahead.
Sure. Well, Jen, you asked us all to reflect on physical spaces where we see difficult conversations happening. So I was reflecting on my own experience as a university professor, where I help to stage these difficult conversations often, and I've been teaching for over 20 years. I've noticed since the 2016 election, students are clamming up when asked to engage in things that are difficult, engage in debate. And I sense on the part of my students that they're getting very conflict avoidant and conflict exhausted. And I'm wondering if any of the panelists can speak to not just finding those trusted and trustworthy sources, but kind of getting to that deeper psychological space that I think the younger generation is in right now of just wanting to avoid all this conflict and all of this trauma, essentially, that our country has been through with their peers. Thank you.
Thanks for that question, Siobhan. And I'm going to try to find some research that a member of our team shared this week about the news cycle and the people are really decreasing the amount of engagement in the news because there's a level of just exhaustion. I don't know, Amanda or Paige, if you all can find it. I think it came from Rupert earlier, that graphic for me, if you can pull it up. Mythili, I'd love to hear you respond to that question, though, for Siobhan.
Yeah, so there's a cognitive bias that we talk about in psychology called the identity protection confirmation. And this is basically, we are social beings. We want to be accepted and we want to be recognized. So we will do things that we think that our family members and our loved ones around us will like. We don't want conflict, because we don't want to break those bonds with our loved ones. It's kind of going back to that bubble that we talk about, that we like our bubbles. It's difficult. Change is hard, and nobody wants to be told that they're wrong. I mean, if we see somebody share misinformation on the web, how are we going to approach them and say, this is wrong, like you need to take it down? Nobody wants to be told that. So I think it goes back to, how we are as human beings and social beings, and, want to create those kind of bonds with people around us.
I'm in your just personal interactions with people, I'm sure you run into this quite a bit. What approach have you taken to bridging that gap, to sort of breaking down the reservations someone may have around engaging in what might be a conflict?
Yeah, so very often, I'm probably one of the first women of color that a lot of my students have engaged with, especially in a university classroom setting. So very often that itself creates that opportunity to kind of talk about something that they might not be comfortable with. I'm not an American. I came from somewhere. I'm an immigrant, so I do have an accent. That's, again, something that, in a university setting is something that some of my students might not expect when they come to my classroom, So creating those kind of spaces to have those dialogues, I think that's something that we really do quite often in a classroom setting or in a university setting. But just, I often begin with like an example, creating that connection with that other person, saying that, hey, I understand where you come from, right? I mean, you might have never seen somebody like me before, and that's okay. But, there's always this first time. Let's talk about it. Let's engage in that conversation. And creating that connection with them really it helps them open up a little bit more. And that's the same thing with misinformation too, right? I mean, if you see somebody share misinformation on the web, you might want to start by saying, hey, you know what? I've done that before too, and this is how I stop myself from sharing misinformation. So always seeing the other person's point of view and the other person's perspective, I think that's a really great way to start.
And I think it's important to acknowledge that the types of engagement may be different. So if we're engaging as journalists, Tom, we have a certain set of responsibilities in that space. But if I'm engaging with someone on a more personal level, just me talking to you, I'm off the clock, hallelujah, that engagement is going to be different. And I'm going to go into that conversation without the goal of changing your mind. I just want to understand why you believe what you believe. And so it sort of lowers the stakes a little bit in that person-to-person conversation, because I'm trying to understand you, and I want you to understand me too. And that's part of how I've moved through the last several years. Tom, I wanted to hear about this though from the media perspective. I found my team found the graphic for me, and there's been this change in news engagement from 2021 to 2022. Social media interactions with news articles has dropped 50%. Cable news primetime viewership dropped 19%. News media app sessions 16%. Unique visit to the top 5 news sites has dropped 18%. And this is from 2020 to 2021. And this appears to be a reaction to just exhaustion, to a barrage of what a lot of people feel is bad news. So Tom, are you running into that in your work? It's like we've got to tell you what's happening, but people are just tired.
I don't think there's any question. It used to be the thing called the news cycle, and back in the day, for some of the folks who remember the news cycle, it was once a day. You know, it was 6 o'clock when the news came on, the national news, then your morning paper or your afternoon paper. It wasn't continuous, and really it's been a continuous loop well over 10 years now. Certainly through the Trump administration, there was a lot more breaking news, organizations trying to be competitive. So it was totally exhausting for the media and for media consumers. It said, I need to unplug here and step away. I cannot keep doing this nonstop 24 hours a day. And you could do it 24 hours a day. There's 24-hour news channels, more than one of them. So it makes our job more difficult. We try to be a little more selective. We try to pick stories that move the story and just don't repeat the story. Don't move it incrementally. Maybe take a new angle or a new approach, or ignore the story for a day. Because you know what? It's still going to be there tomorrow. So why not just let it sit a day, see what we can find out new about it, or try to find something that will make it more understandable and maybe people can absorb it a little bit better. But it is, I mean, one reason I'm not on social media a lot, when I leave work and go home, I don't get back on social media. I just don't, unless, you know, my kids text me or something, but I just don't. I need to step away and move away.
We got this question from Nancy, who says, how do we make ourselves accountable to look at or read the other side? It is too easy to just find and follow info we agree with. So how do we challenge ourselves to move outside of our bubbles? Mythili, what do you think?
Yeah, it's Nancy, it's really easy to, like I said before, that confirmation bias, where our brain seeks out information that advances our beliefs and supports our beliefs. So it's really easy not to see the other perspective, but I think it goes back to that, you know, the difficult conversation that we've been having. Like, try to understand the other person's perspective, try to put yourself in that other person's shoes and see what is that worldview, right? I mean, what is that upbringing?
But how do you do that without falling into the misinformation rabbit hole? So, for instance, the sky is blue. Well, this other person says, well, the sky is green. It's like, well, let me do some research on whether or not the sky is green. And you end up down a rabbit hole where the sky is still blue, but you have found what feels like reliable sources that say it's green. So where is that balance?
It's a tough balance. I mean, you really want to, you know, understand the other person's perspective, but at the same time, we want to be discerning of the fact that actually could be fabricated, and that actually could be misleading, and actually could be biased. So it's really difficult to you know, kind of have kill two birds with one stone, I think. But, you know, that dialogue needs to happen. And I think keeping an open mind and, you know, reading as much as we can. I don't know, you know, how much people read these days. So just keeping an open mind, going to the library, you know, opening an account, it's free. And, you know, trying to read as much as you can. I think that's really one way of keeping your mind open.
Can I jump in and just say we do have a lot of resources. One series is called Opposing Viewpoints, which give both sides of various hot button topics. We also have something called CQ Researcher, which does the research for you, so you can have a concise roundup of questions answers to questions you may have, news sources that were published. Newsbank and ProQuest also publish, whenever there's a new hot button issue, they do a roundup of the news that is released and posted and available for anyone with a library card to access from home. So, and if you don't know where to start, I mean, a catalog search will help you get started. You don't even have to ask any of the library staff members. You can do it from home at midnight and, you know, get a start. So anyway.
Mm-hmm. And just a reminder, there's still time to text us your questions or comments. Tom, anything to add?
The one thing I try to do is I try to follow Lyndon Johnson's advice that when your lips are moving, you're not learning. So I try to listen when I have a conversation to people and try to absorb what they're trying to say. I don't assume that I'm right or that I know everything. I'm trying to learn from them. I might doesn't mean I agree with them. I might disagree with them, but I'm more informed by having the conversation with them. And at some point, you may have to agree to disagree, but at least have the conversation and listen is what I try to do. I'm not always successful, but I try to be, and try to get another viewpoint.
Yeah. Well, Phil, who's with us this evening, is definitely feeling the fatigue. He says people don't want to hear news like war in Europe or COVID. They're trying to go to work and care for families. Often they are overwhelmed. You know, on our show 1A, we have these editorial discussions about when our audience needs a break. It's like we might need to do something a little lighter on Thursday because it's just been this fire hose of news. And it's like when we have reached that threshold, we know our audience has been there for several days already because it's our job. So we really try to balance out the schedule over the course of the week to lighten things up a little bit because I think people need it. We got this question from another member of the audience. It's from Martin, who says, how do we protect our elderly family and friends from misinformation? And I think this is a demographic that often gets overlooked when we talk about social media. A lot of focus is put on young people, but there are elders who are on Facebook. I know many of them, and there aren't the kinds of there's not that media literacy piece that's necessarily at work for them, especially in that social media realm. So Mythili, what about that piece of it, protecting elders who are online?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Martin. So the elderly is considered to be a vulnerable population for misinformation. So, you know, they don't have that kind of media literacy that we expect from the younger generation. So one way, again, is to give them that resources, you know, going back to that infographics that I was talking about, creating those kind of, you know, visually appealing infographic, just like a one sheet, right? And just like kind of give it to them and be like, okay, you know, keep this in your pocket, right? I mean, the next time you see a news article, maybe whip it out and be like, oh, okay, this is what I need to do, you know, okay, I'm safe kind of thing. Or just have conversations with them, like when you meet them for Thanksgiving or for Christmas, just kind of, you know, ask them about their media literacy or educate them more about that kind of, you know, how to be careful about misinformation. And even just tell them that there is actually a lot of misinformation out there, right? That might also not be something that they're familiar with. So just kind of educate, talk, and have these kind of pieces of infographics available.
We got this question, and this is something that came up in another conversation I had recently at the Aspen Ideas Fest. And this person says, what about when the other perspective involves denying someone's personhood in some way, including your own? Thinking of misinformation targeting trans people, black people, etc., it's frustrating to be told to just listen in those circumstances. And I was in conversation with an activist in Aspen, and I'm trying to remember her exact phrase, but she said, the line for her was something to this effect: the line for me is harm. If you are intent on doing me harm, I will not engage in that kind of conversation. And I said, oh, okay, so that's a clear boundary, and that makes sense to me. Mythili, from your perspective, when you're trying to engage in a conversation, but it's someone who is coming in without a full acknowledgement of your personhood, what does your research say about that?
Yeah, I mean, research has shown that women of color and people belonging to lower incomes disproportionately have access to good information and real information. And so they also have, going back to that issue about accessibility, they don't have access to good healthcare or, good healthcare information that is available to them. So how are you creating, how are you deciding, how are you making these kind of decisions about, some volatile topics that exist in our community today? If you don't have equal access to information, and that equal access to information is something that has come up, I think, in the Wichita context, again, with, underrepresented and minority communities. I work quite often with the refugee community in Wichita. Majority of them are from the Democratic Republic of the Congo. They speak Swahili. Many of them have not gone to school. Their literacy levels are really poor. But they, I've interacted with them. I speak baby Swahili. And, very often it is that access to proper information that is really missing in that community. So at the same time, when you're asking them to take a decision or make a vote, where is that decision making really coming from, right? It's tough.
I mean, I think that echoes this comment we got from Olivia, who says, I think everything being shared this evening is true for people who have the capacity or mental space to research, to discern, to vet, but that's not the case for individuals who are low income or have many responsibilities or are generally overwhelmed. This does certainly include our elders, but what about the single parents, those working several jobs? What steps would you take if you were experiencing socioeconomic drought? I think I want to circle back to this, the previous question I had about the acknowledgement of a person's humanity. But Tom, how much of this responsibility is on us as media, as journalists, to actively reach into communities and find ways to meet them where they are, to give them access to this information rather than them having to chase it down?
I think it's very important for us to try to do that, and we have had successes and failures at doing that over the years. And media in general tends to have a certain demographic, a certain people who read, subscribe, whatever, and we have not done a very good job on that. Continue to try to get better at it, but it is important that the media try to reach people where they live on topics and issues that matter to them in their lives. A lot of them, they're working two jobs. They don't really care what Congress is doing. But if we can tell them what Congress is doing affects you in this way, then it's an effective story. But there's work to be done there, no doubt.
Mm-hmm. And Sarah, what about the role of libraries?
I was going to mention two things. I think that the library is working to partner with community organizations to help get out into the community. We are currently forming a partnership with Facts Not Fear ICT, which revolved around the pandemic and vaccines. And they have large reach into the minority communities that we do not necessarily have. We are working to make, or to help cross the digital divide, though, and provide access to devices that would allow people to get connected to the internet. We've had immense success with our hotspot lending and with some of the ARPA money. We purchased 250 Chromebook hotspot bundles. And the waiting list, I mean, they've checked out thousands of times in a year. The need is exponential to what we have the ability to provide. So we continue to look for more funding and more opportunities to help provide access, but we also help provide the education on how to use it. We have a dedicated team at the main library, technology trainers, who that is their whole job. And they do one-on-one training with people who come in. Many of them are elderly because they have not had, we see a bump around the holiday season when people get new tablets from their family and they have no idea how to use them. So we are there to help them learn how to use them, help them get started on the correct way to research things on their tablet and do searches and those sorts of things. So we also do provide on our website information literacy resources on a page on our website so that we can direct people there when they just have general questions or it's a phone call or something like that.
I want to invite Andrew up to the mic. He has a question, and while we're waiting for Andrew to come up, Mythili, I do want to circle back to, we're talking about engaging in difficult conversations and how to have conversations around misinformation. But I think sometimes it's important to say you have permission to have boundaries. And it is okay to not engage in a conversation if someone is not acknowledging you as the full human being.
Absolutely. If there's any ground for malicious intention or maligning somebody or hate, right? I mean, there's definitely that boundary that should exist. And, if you don't feel comfortable, just walk away. You don't have to engage in that moment and engage in that conflict situation. Just walk away. And I've walked away, from conversations where I felt threatened, right? Or I felt that there's too much hate and I just don't want to engage anymore. So yes, it's perfectly okay to have boundaries, and I think everybody should have them.
Andrew, go ahead.
So we've talked about the challenges that, libraries face, that the media faces, that universities and young people face regarding disinformation and misinformation. But what is the real problem here? Is it a problem with society, or is it a problem with tech? Because it seems that it's just not hard. It feels like it's not hard to put the blame on multi-billion-dollar tech companies that promote this kind of content that is, fueled by these largely unregulated algorithms.
Mm-hmm. So is it a problem of humanity or is it a problem of tech? And each of you may have slightly different answers to that, but Sarah, I'll start with you.
I don't have my numbers to back this up, but I know that many schools do no longer have their school librarians who used to teach the classes on how to do research skills. It may just be one person for an entire school. And how do you teach that many kids how to use a library when funding is being cut? You can't purchase necessarily new materials. When so much of your job needs to be teaching them how to use the internet, and kids aren't able to keep pace because they may not have access to those devices at home. So I think that there are things that could be done better earlier in life. And we certainly try to get schools to come in for tours so that we can help them explore, get to know their local library. But it is hard, when there's not necessarily the dedicated time to, this is how you research, and this is how you find information, or there's just simply not enough staff.
Mm-hmm. So what I'm hearing you say, Sarah, is there's been a loss of a certain type of education, media literacy, civic education, the kinds of things that would prepare you to be a more savvy media user?
That is what I have heard. I do not have a school-age child yet, so I have not experienced it myself as a parent, but I have been led to believe that there is a gap in the early school education, and I've heard at universities that students are coming in without necessarily having the research skills. Perhaps you can speak to that and whether that is actually
I just want to mention we did 2 shows fairly recently, one on media literacy, another on civic education, and the data bears that out. So I think that is a piece of it. But Mythili, go ahead.
Yeah. Great question, Andrew, and I think the answer to it is both. I think both social media and personally a reader is responsible for sharing that misinformation. I want to go back to a statistic from March of 2020 where 31% of Americans actually believed that the COVID-19 virus was created and was a hoax. And, we talk about this in psychology as an illusory truth kind of effect. Once you have engaged with fake news, you are more predisposed to believe that fake news. It's your cognition. It's how you're wired as a human being, right? So, given that there was no evidence to back that up, and there was new evidence suggesting that it was actually not a hoax and, this is an actual real virus, people still believe that this is a hoax, even though they were presented with this information, because that's how your brain works, right? But on the same time, social media, they are not passive, right? They are actually enablers of this, because again, going back to that algorithm, going back to that, engagement and clickbait and all that, they are actually playing a role in appealing to your emotions, appealing to your cognition, and showing you things that are an algorithm specifically created for you, right, and your media profile. So I think it's a little bit of both, and I think we need to be more accountable personally, but also have social media and tech be more accountable as well.
Okay, I just want to mention that Andrew is an intern at KMUW, so in support of your internship, I want to know if you have a follow-up question.
I wasn't prepared for this.
Fair enough. It's okay. It was a really good question and an important one. So it's a yes and. We have just time for one more question. We got this message from Jesse who says, also something I struggle with is both sidesing issues. I have a family member and thinks they're extra objective and thinks they're extra objective by listening to all sides. Sometimes the other side is simply in bad faith or irrelevant. And this is something we've heard a lot about in recent years, especially around media, Tom, is don't both sides this thing. And how are you all approaching that at KMUW?
I think media's moved pretty well beyond that you got to have both sides represented when there's not a side to be represented on the other side, or that the other side, so to speak, is just making stuff up, or they're not based in fact. But it is difficult because then you get pushback from the other side. What we try to do is we try to look at a story. We try to look at a story objectively, fairly. We try to present it in a way that if I was on the other side of this story, would I feel that I was represented fairly, not necessarily quoted, but represented fairly. My point of view was represented fairly. It gets back to the point about, someone writing a story about slavery and the evils of slavery and saying, well, hey, we got to get the other side on that. Okay, well, there is no other side on that. There is no other side. And so you got to avoid that simple thing like that. On controversial issues, abortion certainly, guns, things like that, then I think you do have to present as best as you can, an even-handed approach to that topic. But not all topics lend themselves to that, and we shouldn't be fooled into thinking that they all do.
Yeah, there's a saying that's used quite a bit in journalism circles, that if someone says it's raining, it's not our job to find someone who says it's not. Our job is to look out the window and see if it's raining. That's our job. We just have a minute here to wrap up, and I just love to hear from each of you what the road ahead looks like for you when it comes to either combating mis or disinformation or just trying to ensure Wichita is an informed community. And Sarah, I'll come to you first.
My hope for us is that we are able to keep building our resources to get technology out into the community, because I think for a lot of people that is the first step. And for us, we will just continue to build the best set of resources we can, whether that's print or online. Keep fighting for funding to purchase the things that we think would benefit our community in their quest to educate themselves, and to continue to provide as an unbiased collection that does present both sides of controversial issues and is filled with trustworthy resources, because that's how we stay in business, is people's trust.
Yeah. Tom, what about for you in listening to this conversation? I said, oh, there's a follow-up story here about media literacy in Kansas. There's a follow-up story here about civic literacy. There's one about the digital divide in Kansas, but what's the road ahead for you?
Well, I think it's been a difficult road, and I'm not sure it's going to get any easier in the next 4 to 6 years. But it's an important task that we have, and I don't think we can just give up. There's too much at stake. I think any city, a quick story about Wichita. Wichita was founded in the 1860s, 1870s. The first thing the city fathers did was go recruit a newspaper. They went and hired Marsh Murdoch to start the Wichita City Eagle, because they knew that a newspaper was important to a city's growth, to informing the citizenry, and to make it strong civically. And I don't think that's really changed since then. Everything about the media has changed, but those core values, a city can't grow unless there's active media pointing out its successes and its failures. And I think that's incumbent upon us to do that, even if people sometimes don't care for us to do that. I just think that's too important. We will never bridge this political divide we have now without an active media. Will we ever bridge it? I don't know. We will never bridge it without an active media informing people with accurate information.
Mythili, I'll give you the last word here.
Wichita is very diverse, and I think in order to make Wichita really inclusive, we need to have access to information, not just English, but in the multiple languages that we have in our community. We need to have and create access to education for minority populations, for people from low income, for the elderly, for the underrepresented. That's the way that we make this community more inclusive. And that access to information is really important, because when we make this community more inclusive, there's better decision making that's going to happen.
Well, we're going to leave it there. Sarah, Tom, Mythili, thank you so much for being a part of this important conversation this evening. We really appreciate it.